welcome to Tanakh Talk. I am your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with episode number 58 of A Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament with Rabbi Michael Skobac, tonight discussing Acts chapter 25. Rabbi, it's actually kind of fun saying that. It's like, you remember the guy who did the boxing announcement? Let's get ready to rumble. One of these days, I'm going to come up with my own little theme, and it's just going to be like so ridiculous that no one will want to copy it, but everybody will know it. There was a company, a concrete mixing company in Austin at one time, or Austin or Nashville somewhere, and they did the very right thing. Most of them are thinking neutral colors, nice pleasant colors. Well, this one was like a hot pink cement mixer truck, and everyone knew who that company was because it was like no one would dare do that, but they knew who they were.
You're going to break the internet.
Well, Rabbi, it's good to have you back, man. We are man, coming up close to that back door, getting ready to slam it shut and moving into the backyard of Romans. And man, I'll tell you what, it's just getting more excited each episode that passes by. So can't wait to see what happens tonight.
Don't get too excited. It's not like you're going into the Tanakh here.
Right. I have a question though. Are we going to go straight chronological, or are we going to finish Romans and then maybe pick a random different book and then kind of do the random playlist, or are we going to kind of attack it like in an order that it's written in?
Of course, that bridge when we get there. But yeah, I was imagining we'd just go straight through. But if there's some, there may come a time like we skip the other three. There's three gospels,
right? So
there may come a time when we say, you know what, maybe we'll skip that book for whatever reason. But
right, gotcha.
Yeah, we'll have to have a powwow.
That's okay. That's okay.
Have a meeting.
Have a come to Jesus meeting. Okay.
Yeah, we don't have that many planning meetings. we sort of do it on the fly.
Yeah, flies are good, except for the gnats in the room right now. I'll tell you about that later.
I don't want to hear about that.
Oh, man. That's okay. All right, Rabbi, I'll turn it over to you. And as usual, I'll follow along. I'm going to open the phone lines just in case anybody wants to call in. If you do call in, please do stick with tonight's topic, Acts chapter 25. Any other question will be rerouted to a different show. So just be ready for that. So don't think I'm derailing you because I don't like you or your topic. It's just we got to keep everything in the right topic zone. So there we go. All right, Rabbi, take it away.
So, these chapters, Paul's being bounced around like a ping pong ball from trial to trial. So before we get into chapter 25, let me just sort of put into perspective. Going back to chapter 23, Paul gets into into a heap of trouble. And there's already going back before that, actually, riots break out. And in chapter 23, a Roman commander basically saves Paul from the mob that wants to lynch him. But this Roman commander wants to understand why Paul's in so much trouble. So he basically summons the chief priests and their council. It's not clear if this council is the actual Sanhedrin. I have my doubts, but it's clearly, as the story is presented, it's a council of important Jews. And, they are going to have this first trial of Paul, and Paul manages to throw them into a whole squabble about the idea of the resurrection of the dead, and a fight breaks out, and nothing really seems to happen. And so it apparently turns out that after this trial, where it's interesting, in chapter 24, they don't really seem to come to a conclusion about Paul at that trial that hearing before the council, but apparently a plot breaks out again, another plot to kill Paul, and so the Roman administrators whisk him out of Jerusalem up to Caesarea to save him, and he's there now under the jurisdiction of Felix, who locks him up. And we discussed last week what happened with Felix. And he's there and basically held under protective custody, sort of, for about 2 years until Felix is relieved of his duties by Festus. So in chapter 25, we see that Festus had left Caesarea to go down to Jerusalem or they say here to go up. We usually say going up to Jerusalem, but it says that, he went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Apparently, he's the new man in town. He's the new ruler, the new governor, and so he wants to probably check out the major city of Jerusalem and meet with important people. And there in Jerusalem, we're told that the high priest and the chief men of the Jews came to him and informed against Paul to him. So they are again, the Jewish people are presented as agitating against Paul, and they apparently want to have Festus do something. And what it seems like is they want, it doesn't spell it out here in verse 2, but apparently they want him to release Paul from protective custody so they could kill him. They want to have Festus send Paul back to Jerusalem from Caesarea, and apparently Festus would not realize that he's a security risk, because the first time he fled Jerusalem, we saw that there was a tremendous armed guard that went, a whole platoon of soldiers. It's possible Festus wouldn't realize that Paul was in danger, so he might send him back to Jerusalem with a very small detail, and then anyone that wanted to kill Paul could have done it. But Festus doesn't really do this. He maybe isn't prepared to make any decisions just as he comes into office. So he says that no, Paul's going to be kept in Caesarea, and that he himself would be going there shortly, he tells them. And he says, anyone, therefore, that wants to accuse Paul or prosecute Paul, you can go to Caesarea with me and see if there's any fault with Paul there. Now, it seems that this plot that we hear about here to kill Paul as he's going to be going down from Caesarea to Jerusalem is really a continuation of the plot that we saw back in chapter 23. The difference is interesting, that there in chapter 23, the plot was really just 40 vigilantes who had this idea of killing Paul, and they Jewish leaders are really brought in to that plot as accomplices. But here in chapter 25, it sounds like the leaders of the Jewish people are not accomplices. They are the actual ringleaders of this scheme, or this plot to kill Paul. Now, a big question, I mentioned this before, that looms in all of these chapters is, who is Paul? Who really is Paul? And is he essentially identical with the Jewish followers of Jesus that are based in Jerusalem? Sometimes in literature they're called the Jerusalem Church, or I like to refer to them as the followers of Jesus who are now left in Jerusalem. These are the actual students of Jesus, relatives of Jesus, like Peter and John and James, and these are the actual people that were with Jesus for the years of his ministry, and now they're leading. They're the leading apostles. And so the question is Paul on the same page with these men? Is he essentially identical to the followers of Jesus in Jerusalem? Now, if Paul is basically cut of one cloth from Peter and John and James and those people, the question is, why is he singled out here for all this persecution? Especially, we were told that Paul was a Roman citizen. He'd have more protection, really, from any kind of persecution than Peter and John and James, who probably were not Roman citizens. So the question is, why is Paul constantly in trouble and people plotting against his life to kill him, when it doesn't seem that the Jerusalem group are really in any kind of danger? They seem to be operating openly in Jerusalem. We know that they go to the temple, they worship in the temple. So it is strange that in all these chapters, Paul is constantly being dogged and hunted, and people are trying to kill him. And so I wonder, why aren't the other Jewish followers of Jesus being targeted in the same way. And so, question is, who are these Jewish leaders that are going after Paul? And maybe I'll come back to discuss that in a few minutes, because I wonder, I'm wondering out loud here, if perhaps Paul was really in a very different league than the Jewish group in Jerusalem who were followers of Jesus and awaiting his return to bring about the Messianic age. I suspect that he was not of one cloth, of one type with them. So we continue now in verse 6, where we're told that when he had remained there among them for more than 10 days, meaning when Festus was taking care of his business and going to his meetings and doing whatever else he had to do in Jerusalem for about 10 days, he went back to Caesarea, and the next day we're told he was on the judgment seat, and he commanded Paul to be brought. In verse 7, when Paul had come, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood about and laid many serious complaints against Paul, which they couldn't prove. This is at least Luke claiming that they couldn't prove their complaints. And while Paul, this is now Luke just reporting on what happened, while he answered for himself, meaning that Paul defended himself, he said, "Neither against the law of the Jews, the Torah of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended in anything at all." Now, we would know what it means to say that I didn't do anything against the Torah. He seems to be insisting that he was someone who was loyal to the Torah, who observed the Torah, who didn't do anything that was against the Torah. I would put a big question mark on that. I'm not convinced, as we'll see, especially when we get into Paul's writings, that he was such a clear exponent, a clear practitioner, an advocate for Torah observance. I think that I put a big question mark over those words. Now, he might feel that whatever he's doing is somehow in line with the Torah, but if we take the way it would normally be understood, that when someone says that I've done nothing against the Torah, that would seem to mean that I observed all the commandments. I didn't violate any of the commandments. And in the context of the first century back then, it would mean I also followed the teachings of the sages. So not just the written Torah like the Sadducees, but the oral Torah as well, the teachings of the Pharisees. And that seems to be what he would be implying. And again, I am not convinced that he is totally upfront here. But we know at least what he's trying to say. To say that he didn't do anything against Caesar, that's also easy to understand. He's basically saying, I'm not a rebel. I'm not advocating that we overthrow the government. I'm not someone that you can worry about as being treasonous or practicing sedition. He's basically, what he's saying here in denying that he did anything against Caesar, we understand what that means. But in the middle, he says that I didn't do anything against the temple. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean that he didn't spit in the temple? It's not really clear. Now, we know that there were charges that he brought Gentiles into the temple. That was one of the charges against him. I'm not sure that's the only thing that is on the table here. If it is, Paul is simply denying that he brought Gentiles into the temple. Although it would be strange to say this to a Gentile, meaning, Festus might be wondering what's so wrong with bringing Gentiles into the temple. But I don't know if that's what Paul is denying. When he says, I didn't do anything against the temple, I've suggested in the past that Paul really didn't have the same theology as the followers of Jesus back in Jerusalem. We know that Peter and James and John, etc., continue going to the temple and offering sacrifices. And so when Paul comes to Jerusalem in chapter 21, and they confront Paul with these accusations that we heard, Paul, that you are not pro-Torah, that you're not someone who observes the Torah, and that you teach people to not observe the Torah. They want him to take a test to prove his loyalty. And they have him basically sponsor the sacrifices of Nazarites who had finished their period of being Nazarites, and we know from Numbers chapter 6 that they had to bring as part of their ceremony of concluding their term of being a Nazir, they had to bring sacrifices, including a sin offering. And so I suggested that it may be possible, again, there's no proof of this, but it may be possible that they could have asked Paul to do many things. There are hundreds of commandments in the Bible. Why pick this of all the commandments? And so it could be that they were concerned about the reports they heard that Paul had a theology that Jesus was the final sacrifice and he died for the sins of the world, and there's no reason now to have any more sacrifices in the temple, especially sin offerings. And so as a way of probing whether or not this really was something Paul believed, or just trying to see, would he go along with offering a sin sacrifice if it went against his theology? That might have been what they were doing. And so it may be that when he says, I taught nothing, or I did nothing against the temple, he may be saying that I didn't teach, or I don't believe that the temple is essentially no longer something that's relevant. So it's not really clear, again, what he means by this denial about doing something against the temple. And so that's his defense. He defends himself in a straightforward way to Festus. And Festus, we're told, doesn't really say anything, but in verse 9, we're told that Festus wants to do the Jewish people a favor. Not clear why. I mean, I don't know exactly why he was so interested in doing favors for the Jews. None of the Romans were particularly interested in being super nice to the Jewish people. That wasn't their job there. They were there as occupiers,
right.
And they were there to be mean, and tough. They weren't there to be, easy going. And so apparently Festus, we're told, wanted to do a favor for the Jews, and he said to Paul, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and there be judged before me concerning these things?" Now, this is really peculiar, because you would think that Festus can judge him on the spot. Why does Festus now need to go to Jerusalem with Paul to judge him there? He's already heard the charges from the Jewish people against Paul. Paul's given his defense. So it's not clear why it would be important for Festus to go with Paul to Jerusalem to judge him, unless it's just a ruse. It's just a way of getting Paul to travel to Jerusalem under some kind of guard where, they maybe wouldn't look so carefully and the people plotting to kill Paul could kill him. But I find this just a bit of a strange element in this story. Okay. So in verse 10, Paul says that, look, I'm standing at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged. Paul maybe smells a rat about, leaving Caesarea, because he had been warned already to get out of Jerusalem. He was warned that in Jerusalem he's not going to stand a chance. So it could be that Paul is suspicious of this plan, and he's going to do everything he can now to avoid going back to Jerusalem. So Paul says that I stand at Caesar's judgment seat where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I've done no wrong, as you very well know. That's a little bit strange. How would Festus know whether or not Paul did anything wrong, in his relationship with the Jewish people? I don't think Festus has any way of knowing, for example, if Paul really was Torah observant, or whether or not Paul really was someone who, violated the temple in some way. So I don't know why Paul says, as you very well know. Festus just came on the scene and would have no way of verifying any of these things. And in verse 11 he goes on, "For if I am an offender, if I am guilty, or I have committed anything deserving of death, I do not object to dying," Paul says. "But if there's nothing in these things of which these men accuse me, no one can deliver me to them, and therefore I appeal to Caesar." So Paul now asked to be tried essentially in Rome before the Caesar. And Again, I think that he probably sensed he wouldn't make it to Jerusalem, so that he wants to avoid that possibility. Now, in Rome, he would be tried before the king, the non-Jewish king, and it's a totally Roman trial, in front of the king. He's not going to have probably Jewish people involved in that trial, and so his opponents would not be there to press their case against him. The Romans wouldn't really care that much about internal squabbles, especially internal religious squabbles among the Jews. So he probably thought that, in Rome, in front of the king, where there would be no Jewish people to give him a hard time, he would just get off scot-free in 2 minutes. However, there could be a downside in going to Rome. And the downside could be that if the Romans, the Caesar, I think at this point, by the way, the Caesar is Nero, Caesar Nero, if they would see Paul as an extension of Jesus, meaning that if Paul is telling them, look, I'm a follower of Jesus, and I believe Jesus rose from the dead, and he's coming back, and I am basically here to promote the teachings of Jesus and whatever Jesus was about, and they know that Paul is someone who's running around the Roman Empire. He's not just hanging out in Jerusalem. He's going all over Asia Minor, and they might see him as an activist and an agitator in the same way they might have seen Jesus. Jesus was executed by Rome for proclaiming himself as the king. And so if for some reason the Romans would see Paul as this kind of extension of Jesus, that would land him into a heap of trouble in Rome. So he might think that he's taking the safe way out, but it may not really be that way. Now, I'm going to suggest something that I'm going to go out on a limb here. You'll have to excuse me. I try not to usually do this. I try to not go out on too much of a limb, and I try to, let you know when I'm being speculative. So I'm going to say now that what I'm going to share, I think is very speculative. But I wonder. It's something that I wonder about. And here it is. The Gospels, we went through the whole Gospel of Matthew. The Gospels take a story of Jesus being executed by the Romans for a political crime. On his cross, the Romans wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. The Romans wouldn't really care if Jesus was doing things that violated Judaism. That was not something that was high on the priority concerns of the Romans. But the Romans were very concerned of treason, of agitation, of any kind of rebellion, or anyone that questioned their authority. And so if Jesus is proclaiming himself the King of the Jews, and there are crowds welcoming him as essentially the Messiah when it comes to Jerusalem, so the Romans would snuff his life out in a heartbeat. They're not interested in allowing people like this to live, and they would execute them by crucifixion left and right. So that's really what happened to Jesus. But what the Gospels try to do is morph that story, transform that story into a story of religious persecution by the Jewish leadership. So when you read the Gospels, it really sounds like that the problem that Jesus is having is not so much the Romans. As a matter of fact, at his trial, Pontius Pilate says, I see nothing wrong with this man, and he's prepared to let Jesus go. But it's the Jewish people that are clamoring for Jesus to be executed. And what you see throughout the Gospels is that Jesus is being hounded and attacked, apparently, by the leaders of the Jewish people for religious crimes, either for blasphemy or for violating the Torah or for teaching people things that were inappropriate. So that's what happens in the Gospels. That's pretty clear to me. Now, what I wonder is if it's not possible that Acts, the book of Acts, transforms a story of Paul's trouble with whom? I think that Paul's major problem was from his fellow followers of Jesus, from what you could call today his fellow Christians. And I think that that's really where his troubles originate, where he really had the most difficulties, the people that had the most problems with him. I think in the Jewish world, he would have been a dime a dozen. And again, as I mentioned, we don't see the Jerusalem church persecuted and hounded like Paul seems to be. So I'm wondering if perhaps what happens in the book of Acts is that the story that really is going on behind the scenes that we don't see is that Paul may be in a heap of trouble from his fellow Jewish Christians, from his fellow believers in Jesus who are Jewish. That's the people that are after him. But what happens in the book of Acts is that the whole story is transformed into one where Paul is being persecuted by the chief priests and the Sanhedrin and the Jewish elders and the leaders and sometimes just the Jews in general. So I'm very speculative here, and I have no way of really proving this suspicion I have, and it's not a strong suspicion, but I'll just confess to you, William, and to the audience that I wonder about this sometimes, because I think that we clearly saw that happening in the Gospels. So what happens from verse 13 now is that we had the new governor of Judea, which is basically Festus, and his Festus is, we saw, based in Caesarea. So he's now going to be visited by the Jewish king, Herod Agrippa II, who really was the last Herodian king. And so we're told that after some days, apparently nothing's happened to Paul. King Agrippa and Bernice came to Jerusalem to greet Festus, meaning they're coming to meet the new governor. There's a new government, and people are going to pay their calls and congratulate him on his new post. And so we're told in verse 14 that when Agrippa and Bernice had been there for many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "Look, there's a certain man left a prisoner by Felix." This is like Felix had thrown this guy into Paul 2 years ago. And Festus says that the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me when I was in Jerusalem asking for a judgment against him. To them I answered. So Festus is saying that I answered these Jewish people. It's not the custom of the Romans to deliver any man to destruction before the accused meets the accusers face to face and has the opportunity to answer for himself concerning the charge against him. I wonder about that. I'm not quite sure that the Romans had such a finely tuned legal system, an ethical legal system, but that's what he says here. Therefore, in verse 17, when they came together without any delay, the next day I sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought in. Meaning I said, look, you guys have a gripe with Paul. I want you to say it to his face. And then in verse 18, when the accusers stood up, they brought no accusation against him of such things as I supposed, but had some questions about him, about their own religion, and about a certain Jesus who had died, but who Paul affirmed to be alive. Now, that's interesting, because when Festus here is sort of recapitulating the whole story to Agrippa, he leaves out all of the political concerns that had been raised about sedition, about treason against Rome. I mean, that was one of the most serious charges. We discussed this in detail in the previous weeks. So here, when Festus is recapitulating the whole case against Paul, all he does is say, look, these guys, these Jews have certain religious questions about Paul and his beliefs, and that's how he leaves it. Festus doesn't really tell the whole story here. And in verse 20, because I was uncertain of such questions, meaning Festus says, what do I know about Judaism? I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there be judged concerning these matters. But when Paul appealed to be reserved for the decision of Augustus, meaning Paul wanted not to be judged by the Jews, but to go to Augustus, which means the worshipped one, the revered one, which is a title for the Caesar. I commanded him to be kept until I could send him to Caesar. So here what we have is the decision finally to try Paul in Rome, really, in Rome before the Caesar. But then in verse 22, Agrippa says to Festus, I would like to hear this man myself. Now, I found in the MacArthur Study Bible something incredibly interesting. So as I mentioned many times, John MacArthur is one of the most respected evangelical scholars today, and he has a very, again, a respected study Bible with his notes. So he has on this verse where Agrippa says to Festus, I would like to hear the man myself. He says that Herod may have been, he says the Greek actually implies this, not just I want to hear him now, but I have been wanting to hear Paul for a long time. I mean, I've been looking forward to this, is the way MacArthur understands the verse. That I've been looking forward to hearing Paul for a long time. Why? So MacArthur said he relished hearing Christianity's leading spokesman. Now, I fell out of my seat when I read that. Why does anyone at that point think that Paul is Christianity's leading spokesman? It's possible if you were living in Asia Minor, somewhere, where Paul had been running around outside of Israel, and that's all you knew was about Paul, then you might think that Paul was the only or the major spokesman of the major spokesperson for Christianity. But anyone that's based in Israel, and both Festus and Agrippa were based in Israel. If they knew anything about the Christians, the Jewish believers in Jesus, they would have known about the whole movement in Jerusalem, because they knew these are the followers that were with Jesus when he was alive. So why in the world would Agrippa think that Paul was the leading spokesperson of Christianity? I was floored by that. Again, I can see how today any Christian would say, well, sure, Paul was much more important than James. Who was James? James is only the brother of Jesus who led the church for 30 years. And who is Peter? Somehow Paul, who never met Jesus, he's the most important spokesperson, the leading spokesperson. So I think this kind of verse says a lot about a contemporary Christian for whom Paul is the most important, right? I don't think he's saying so much. How does he know that Festus really thinks that Paul's the most important spokesperson? I think that John MacArthur and probably a boatload of Christians today would say, sure, the most important Christian spokesperson would have been Paul. I think that's bizarre, personally, very peculiar. Especially when we study the books of Galatians and Romans, especially Galatians, we'll see how much tension there was between the actual followers of Jesus and Paul. And again, there's a whole issue of who really is a legitimate disciple and who really is leaning towards heresy. So anyway, Festus says to Agrippa, sure, tomorrow you can meet with him. And so we're told that the next day Agrippa and Bernice come with great pomp, and they enter the auditorium with the commanders, and they meet with Paul. Anyway, apparently they were told that King Agrippa and all the men who are here with us, you see this man whom the whole assembly of the Jews petitioned me, both at Jerusalem and here, crying out that he was not fit to live any longer. But when I myself found that he had committed nothing deserving of death, and that he himself had appealed to Augustus, I decided to send him to the king, to the Caesar. I have nothing certain to write to you, my lord, concerning him. Therefore I have brought him out before you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the examination has taken place I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable to send a prisoner and not to specify the charges against him. So Festus now is basically saying, look, you can meet with Paul, and after all these examinations, I'm going to have, I'll be able to write a report to send send to the Caesar in Rome when I send Paul there. Now, what's interesting, actually fascinating, is that if we look at the book of Acts here, we remember that Paul appeared, his first trial really, is before the Jewish council. That was in Acts chapter 22 and 23. That was after the whole riot broke out in chapter 21. He appears before the Jewish council. Again, the often people assume it's the Sanhedrin. I'm not convinced, but it was some council, possibly of Sadducean leaders, possibly of high priest. It's not clear, but it's a Jewish council he appears before in Acts 22 and 23. And then he goes before the Roman governor in Acts chapter 24 and 25. And finally here in chapter 25 and in continuing next week in chapter 26, he appears before the Jewish king, King Agrippa. So again, you have Paul appearing before the Jewish council, the Roman governor, and then the Jewish king. And what's interesting is that if you go back to the story of Jesus, Jesus appears before the Jewish council, that was in Luke chapter 22, and then Pilate, who is the Roman governor, in Luke chapter 23, and then before Herod Antipas, which is Luke chapter 23, the Jewish king. The exact same sequence, the three trials before the Jewish council, the Roman governor, and then the Jewish king. And that was the same with Paul and with Jesus. And Paul Tabor suggests that Paul really came to see himself as a second Jesus.
James
Tabor.
Mm-hmm.
I think that James Tabor is one of the most important scholars today in early Christian history.
Right, same here.
A wonderful book he wrote, many books, but wonderful book he wrote called Paul and Jesus.
Right.
Which is really for anyone interested in early Christian history and the development of Christianity. It's an important book. And he suggests that Paul came to see himself, not just as someone who Jesus was speaking to, but almost he was a second Jesus. And what Luke seems to do is to try to present Paul in that way, meaning that whatever happened to Jesus happened to Paul, almost in an eerie sequence that's just about the same. And, I found it, for example, peculiar that you had to have Judas Iscariot betraying Jesus in the Gospels. That if Jesus was coming into Rome, as we're told, if Jesus was coming into Jerusalem on the days before Passover, with a whole group of followers that are proclaiming him as the Messianic king, the Romans would have caught that in 2 minutes. They would have killed him. The Romans had extra guards placed all around Jerusalem because they were expecting riots and rebellions around Passover time. So when you read the Gospels, and the Romans seem to be clueless about Jesus and where he is and what he's up to. And you have to have a Jew with a name like Judas Iscariot being a traitor and informing the Romans where Jesus is located. I read that story and I just say, really? It just doesn't ring true to me. It just doesn't have the ring of truth, because the truth is that the Romans, if Jesus really was coming into Jerusalem as the Gospels portray, and there were people lined up all over the place screaming, Hosanna, the Son of David, and Jesus actually told his followers to arm themselves. We see that in the book of Luke as they marched into Jerusalem. That's the thing that would have provoked the Romans. The Romans would have, in 2 seconds flat, they would have arrested Jesus. And so the story gives you the impression that the Romans are not aware of what's going on. And it requires a Jew with a real Jewish name to turn Jesus in. And you find something, I think, similar here in the book of Acts, where you have all these trials of Paul in front of these different people, and there are always these Jews turning up to persecute him and to charge him and to accuse him. And we're told that there has been plots to kill Paul for chapters now, chapter after chapter after chapter, and they want to kill Paul. Now, what seems strange to me, I have someone, unfortunately, is very ill that calls me a lot, and he's been telling me for about 10 years, 15 years now, that he knows people are trying to kill him. And I'm always telling him that I don't think anyone's trying to kill you, because they would have done it by now. 15 years of people trying to kill someone, they would have gotten to him at some point.
Right.
And I think that if people really wanted to kill Paul, I don't think it would have been too hard. And so these stories where they have to somehow maneuver, this getting Paul to travel to a certain place with just a little bit of a guard. I think it would have been very, very easy. If there really was a plot to kill Paul, they could have done it. And I suspect that that what we're reading here is really a very embellished story to really lay it on thick, in the sense of, taking this opportunity to again portray the Jews, as these people that in the same way they persecuted Jesus, they persecuted Paul, and they went after him chapter after chapter after chapter, following him, accusing him, trying to get the authorities to take care of him. And it doesn't have, to me at least, a solid ring of truth, because I imagine in my mind that it wouldn't have been so impossible for them to have killed Paul, knock him off if they really wanted to.
Sure.
There were people that were plotting to kill Paul, we're told, even before he came back to Israel, on the boat coming, towards Israel. And so they're portraying this, as ongoing plots, to kill him. As I mentioned before, he seems to be someone that just constantly is arousing opposition. And so it's hard for me to imagine that this would have to drag on for years here, years of trials and, going from one place to another and being dragged out of Jerusalem and taken up to Caesarea with, 100 guards. And just the story to me, again, I could never prove that that didn't happen, but I'm just not filled with confidence that what we're reading is very accurate history. So next week, God willing, when we get to chapter 26, we'll be looking at the continuation of this story with Herod and Festus, and then ultimately we'll be seeing Paul in Rome.
And oh, what a joy that will be.
Well, I want to go to Rome myself. It's a dream my wife and I have, to go to Italy and to Rome. So maybe we'll meet some cool people there.
There you go. It'd be nice to meet somebody who could actually validate some of the stories. I don't think that's going to happen. Rabbi Singer today brought up a really excellent point. He said, if the Christianity of the Bible was indeed a legitimate thing, why is it that Hashem did not preserve all the families of that era like he did in Judea? Today, you, Rabbi Michael Skobac, can say that my generations were at Sinai, but no one in Christianity could say that we were all there, during the book of Acts. No one can. It's just like it completely died off, and it's like, it's interesting. It really is thought-provoking altogether. So,
yeah, I think that we discussed this back in the in chapter 5. Where Gamliel gives his test of credibility, that if it's of God, you can't stop it, and if it's not of God, it's going to fall apart. And the truth is, I would never say that I can prove this 1,000%, but sure. I think it's pretty clear that the people who follow Jesus, I think that all the evidence shows us that they were loyal, observant Jews. Yeah. They were Torah observant Jews. And, they not just were Torah observant, but they were Torah observant in the full sense of the word. They were observant of the Torah according to rabbinic teaching, according to the oral law.
The oral law, right.
And we have, again, historical evidence of this, and they didn't think that Jesus was God. They just thought he was the Messiah, and they were simply awaiting for him to return and to bring about the messianic restoration of Israel. And that movement of Jews who were Torah observant and who did not worship Jesus as God, that movement did not last very long. Probably within 200 years, by the time, let's say, Constantine comes along, it's gone. All you really have by the time of Constantine, probably 99.9% of the followers of Jesus at that time are Gentile, and they are people who do not observe the Torah. As a matter of fact, by that time, the church had been persecuting anyone that was Torah observant. They clearly believed that Jesus is God. The only question at Nicaea was in what way Jesus was God. Was he fully God from the beginning, or did he become God at some point?
Right.
But these are people, I would contend, that have zero in common with Peter and James and John. And so it's very clear that the Jesus movement did not last historically. What lasted was really what began either with Paul or with students of Paul, followers of Paul. And, it became a movement essentially, that's the big, the big turnaround, that originally if anyone told you they were someone who believed that Jesus was the Messiah, you would know they were a Jew, because there were no Gentiles in the beginning. And after about 250 years, 200 years, it's not clear exactly when the tipping point was where they disappeared totally, but by the 4th century, they're gone. And if someone told you they believed in Jesus as the Messiah, you would know for certain that they were a Gentile. And we know that it didn't take long. You already see this happening in the 2nd century. Already in the 2nd century, that the church leaders are becoming vehemently and virulently anti-Jewish, hostile to Jews altogether. And we know that the horrible history of the church and its shameful history in terms of how they treated their Jewish brethren. It's incredible how much the historical Christianity diverted and veered from its original moorings. God didn't seem to see fit to preserve the Jesus movement. They did die out.
You know what? I want to break our typical protocol, our typical layout. If you don't mind, we got like 5 minutes left. Would you? Can I pop a random question on you that has nothing to do with tonight?
Sure.
Okay. This is going out to John Anon, or Anon, Anon, on YouTube. He's been watching a lot of the Tanakh Talk videos, and he has put up something here, and I want you to respond to it if you don't mind. I think it'd be good for him to hear your spin on it. Okay, so John Anon says, Jews stand on their own self-righteousness and provide their own salvation through good works. I'll stand on Jesus, righteousness for my salvation, and the plan of salvation comes from God and not man. If man could provide his own righteousness, Adam and Eve would have never left the garden. What would you say to that?
So, this is, a very good representation of Christian theology. What he's expressing is very much the posture of what I would call Pauline Christianity, especially as it is understood in the Protestant world. I'm always criticized when I speak, that I'll do a presentation and I'll get emails saying, well, the Christadelphians don't believe that, so that it's true that the Christian world is, 2 billion people is not monolithic. And we know that the Catholic Church is criticized by the Protestant movements, for their emphasis on works, the need for certain works. So I'm going to say that Pauline Christianity, especially as it's as it's spun by the Protestant denominations. That is exactly what they believe. They believe that human beings are incapable of living righteously, that human beings are incapable of living lives that are pleasing to God, that human beings are born miserable sinners, that after the sin of Adam and Eve in the garden, we are under the grip of Satan and incapable of living righteous lives, of living lives that are pleasing to God and of being righteous. As we're going to get to Paul in the book of Romans, where Paul says there's no one that's righteous, no, not one. And so that's the starting point, that there's a belief that human beings are spiritually corrupt, primarily because of what Adam and Eve did, and that as a result of their sin, all human beings are infected and incapable of living righteous lives. And that because we are incapable of living righteous lives, that becomes the reason why we need Jesus. Paul expresses this in Galatians chapter 3, verse 21, where he says that if righteousness could come through observing the Torah, then Christ died in vain. So Paul's starting point is that we are not capable of following the Torah. We're not capable of observing the laws in the Torah that was given by God. And since we cannot do it, Jesus comes to do it for us. Jesus fulfills the law for us. Jesus' righteousness becomes our righteousness. We are able to live in Jesus by faith in him. That becomes the gospel. The gospel is that, as this fellow is saying, that we cannot be righteous. Mm-hmm. We can do nothing. We are essentially miserable sinners. In TULIP, the acronym of TULIP, the T in TULIP is total depravity. We are totally depraved. And I believe that is a position that is not consistent with what the Hebrew scriptures teach. It is consistent with Paul's theology, totally. But I believe Paul's theology is, doesn't line up with God's theology as expressed in the Hebrew scriptures. For example, after the Garden of Eden, where someone may have walked away with this idea of original sin that cripples people and keeps us under the control of Satan, right after the sin of Garden of Eden, in chapter 4, verse 7 of Genesis, God says to Cain, look, sin is always going to be tempting you. It's always going to be crouching at your door, but you can rule over it. God says to Cain right away, don't think that you're powerless. Don't think that you are unable to overcome the temptation to sin. You can rule over it. And then we see that God chooses the Jewish people for a special mission to be a light unto the nations. And he gives the Jewish people his Torah, his laws at Mount Sinai. And, to say that God gave us Torah that he knew we could not follow. God knew we'd be incapable of keeping it. And yet God threatens terrible, terrible punishments if we don't keep it. And then he actually punishes us when we don't keep it. That's pretty inconceivable. And yet we don't need our own logic to know that it's possible to observe the Torah. God says it explicitly in Deuteronomy chapter 30, that the commandment he's giving us is not too difficult for us to keep. It's not beyond the seas. It's not beyond up in the heavens, that we have to go up into the heavens to be able to bring it down and do it. And it's not beyond the seas, that we should have to cross the seas. But God says to us, it's near to you in your heart and in your mouth, that you can do it. That's what God says. So the truth is, when we read the Tanakh, just with an open eyes and open heart, what you see is, and this is clear as day, that there are righteous people and there are wicked people. You go through the Tanakh, anyone that questions this, just go through the Tanakh with a red pen and just put a little mark every time you see God speaking about those who are righteous, especially as he contrasts them with the wicked. So there are wicked people. These are people who don't follow God's ways, that they are rebellious against God's ways, and yet people don't have to do that. People have the ability to choose God over their own evil inclination, and those people are righteous, and they're called righteous. And so I believe that this theology expressed by this video, I don't remember, John is his name, I think you said?
Yes.
I believe that he's expressing very succinctly Paul's theology, especially as understood by the Protestant movements, but I think that it's a theology which is 180 degrees opposite of what the scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, actually teach.
Right. Wonderful. Well, thank you for taking that. I'll tell you what, I kind of like that idea. I'm thinking maybe we'll call it the final motion of the night. If we get finished early and we got a few minutes, I may pop in somebody's comment or question on or off topic once we've closed our own topic, because I think that'd be kind of handy for people. I think they would like that as that'll be the dessert for them after the main meal.
You want to have dessert, okay?
Rabbi, it's always a pleasure having you on the show. Can't get enough of you. I know everybody else feels the same. Such a wonderful seeing you again. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you same time, same place next week. Shalom and Shavua Tov, everyone.